Hi, welcome back to Originally Lovely. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to crochet the Iris Stitch Tee. This tee is technically an intermediate level crochet pattern, but since I am working it from start to finish with you in this video tutorial, it is suitable for advanced beginners. So the materials that you're going to need are a 4.5mm crochet hook, and I'm using Originally Lovely Cria yarn, which is a light worsted weight baby alpaca yarn. This yarn has excellent drape and stitch definition, which really makes for a lovely top. You can check that out. I have that linked below. So if you can tell, this is a very stretchy stitch and it does have a lot of drape and loft to it. So because of this, we need a foundation single crochet beginning edge that is nice and stretchy and doesn't tighten up the top at the bottom. So as you can see from my swatch here, I just did half double crochets across to start my swatch, and it is a little bit tighter than the stitch itself. So across the entire top, this will make a tightened hem, and it won't be quite as comfortable as the stretchiness that the foundation single crochet creates. So to begin, I will teach you how to work a foundation single crochet. Start with a slip knot and put your slip knot on your hook. I like to make sure that the strand of my slip knot that I can tighten by pulling is the strand that's connected to the ball of yarn. So once your slip knot is on your hook, you're going to chain 2. This is the beginning part of your foundation single crochet. This isn't actually a foundation single crochet stitch itself. This is what you're going to be working onto. So in that second chain from the hook is where you're going to be working. You can see there, that's the first chain from the hook, and then the second chain from the hook is actually the first chain stitch that you worked. Each chain stitch actually has 3 parts to it. There's the V, so that's the front loop only and the back loop only, what it would be referred to. You can see the V there. And then there's a third strand. If you turn over the V, it's considered the bar behind the hook, or the bar behind the chain, or sometimes the third loop. There's a few different things to call it. You can see it right there. So the 3 strands, we're picking up 2 of those 3 strands. So we're going into the V, and we're picking up the top strand of the V, and then also the bar behind the chain. You want both of those on your hook. So insert your hook into both of those strands, and then you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop through those 2 strands of yarn. Once you have that stitch on your loop or on your hook, you will have 2 loops, 2 strands of yarn on your hook. So now you're going to yarn over and chain 1 just through that first stitch on your hook, and then yarn over and pull through both. That is our first foundation single crochet stitch. If you turn it to the side, you can kind of see the 2 chains that we worked at the beginning are like our foundation, and then we have the chain that we worked up, and then the stitch over on the right side connected to the bar on the hook, the loop on the hook. So now what we're going to be working into for our next stitch is a little bit different. We're still going to be picking up 2 of the 3 strands of that chain, but the chain that we started with for when we picked up that first loop is where we're going to be working into. So you can see that right there, that chain, we're going to insert our hook into that chain and then also grab the bar behind the chain. You can kind of see I'm spreading it apart a little bit here. This always confused me so much when I was first learning this stitch, but it really does make it nice and stretchy and secure. So insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, chain 1, and then yarn over and pull through both of the loops on your hook. So now you can see we have 2 foundation single crochet stitches worked. It's a little bit hard to see still, but once I get a few more done here, you'll be able to see how it's forming. So now we're going to work this next stitch just as we did the last one. Insert our hook into that V, also getting the chain behind, or the bar behind the chain, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, chain 1, and then yarn over and pull through both loops on your hook. Now we have 3 foundation single crochet stitches worked. You can see those here, and if you turn your piece to the side, you can kind of see a little bit better how it looks. It almost looks as though you have one row of single crochet stitches already worked, like you're doing the chain and the single crochets at the same time. So here you can see the 3 single crochet stitches across the top and the V's, the chain stitches essentially along the bottom. So we're going to continue across in the same way. Insert into that chain, chain 1, and then yarn over and pull through both to finish that stitch. Once you get the hang of this stitch, it is really handy, and there are quite a few benefits to working this over just a regular foundation chain. So I have a few more stitches here, and you can kind of see how it's starting to develop. It's basically like 2 columns of stitches right next to each other, which is really unique in crochet because normally stitches are more stacked. If you turn this to the side, you can see how it will look when you crochet. So those are going to be the stitches you crochet into on your next row. You can see how it's nice and stretchy, and it just has a really beautiful look. It almost looks like an I-cord in knitting, if you're familiar with that. So depending on the size that you're making, you will need to work quite a decent amount of foundation single crochet stitches. I'm going to be working a smaller amount than you would for if you were actually making this top, just to kind of show you how to get going and work this stitch in the round. So once you have the stitches that you need, you're going to fold this over to join in the round, and you're going to slip stitch with that first foundation single crochet stitch that you worked. So just insert your hook into that first stitch and then pull up a loop through both of the stitches and also the stitch on your hook, as you can see here. So now we have completed our foundation single crochet row, and we have joined to work in the round. So now moving forward to round 1, we will start by working chain 1, and this chain 1 stitch does not count as the first stitch of the round. So just keep that in mind. You will still have to work into the stitch that you just slip stitch into. And when you're finished, make sure you don't work into that slip stitch that's right next to the chain, or you will end up increasing. I'll show you when we get there, but that was always pretty tricky for me when I was just learning how to crochet. So into that first stitch, we're going to work a row of single crochets, back loop only. So insert your hook into the back loop only of that first stitch, yarn over and pull through both of the loops for your first single crochet back loop only. The reason we're doing the back loop only is because it kind of gives a nice, it maintains the look of that foundation single crochet row a little bit better, and it almost looks as though it's an I-cord, if you are familiar with an I-cord in knitting. So continue around this entire round working a single crochet back loop only. You can see how once you have a few stitches worked, how it's just nice and stretchy, and the foundation single crochet row really does give a nice finished hem to the top. So as I mentioned before, this top is worked from the bottom up. So this is the hem of it, and we're working up from the bottom of this piece. So here's what I was mentioning before. Make sure you don't work into that final slip stitch. So if you look here, we have 2 more stitches left to work, and then that third one is actually a slip stitch. So don't work into that, or you're essentially going to be increasing 1 stitch. So work 2 more single crochets, back loop only. You can see I kind of zoomed in here so that you can see that slip stitch there. Again, don't work into that because that's not actually your final stitch. So single crochet into the final stitch, back loop only, and then we need to slip stitch with the first stitch that we worked to join. So you can see it's right above that chain, the stitch that's connected to that chain 1 that we worked just to get up to the height. Slip stitch with that stitch to join. And now we are going to move on to round 2. You can see that it's nice and stretchy, and it just really has a nice finished look, a little bit of, it's kind of substantial, so it's a good piece to work your iris clusters into. So now chain 3. And this is a little bit confusing to show from this point, but this chain 3, the first 2 chains of it are actually going to be our first double crochet stitch. And then the third chain is actually going to be the chain that separates our double crochet stitches in our iris cluster. So I'm pulling the bigger piece to the side here to show you. You can see this is a really unique way to join iris stitch in the round. I haven't seen this before, but I tried many ways, and this is the way that I found that was the best camouflaged. And you can see the seam there, but it's really not super obvious how you're joining the stitches together. The chain is in the center of that stitch, essentially. So it'll make more sense as we get going. But another thing that's kind of unique is we're alternating wrong side and right side rows. So even though we're working in the round, we're turning at the end of our rows, at the end of our rounds, so that seam stays straight. So to begin, yarn over, and then we're going to work 2 more double crochet stitches into that same stitch that we slip stitched into. So the stitch right next to the chain, connected to the chain actually. So work 2 double crochet stitches in that stitch. This is our first stitch on round 2. So you can see this is our first iris cluster, and it's like 3/4 of the way finished. We'll finish it when we get to the other end, and it'll make a little bit more sense after we work a couple rows. So now we're going to skip 3, and then into that 4th stitch, we're going to work our first full iris cluster. So we're going to work 2 double crochets, chain 1, and 2 more double crochets, all into this 4th stitch. So there's our first 2 double crochets, chain 1, and then 2 more double crochets, all into that 4th stitch. So we skipped 3 into the 4th stitch. We're working our first cluster. I'll be referring to these as clusters throughout the pattern, so that will make a little bit more sense to you. They're easier to count. So you can see there we have the 2 double crochets, the chain between them, and then 2 more double crochets. So now skip 3 once more, and into that 4th stitch we're going to work another iris cluster. So 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochets. You might notice that we're working 5 stitches, if you include the chain stitch, into every 4th stitch. So we're essentially increasing on this row, but because the iris stitch has a little bit of a scalloped look to it, it really doesn't get wider. So although it might look wider at first, like you are increasing, you're not, and it does even out as you get a few rows. So again, skip 3 and then work an iris cluster into that 4th stitch. 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochets, all into that 4th stitch. I'm going to zoom forward a little bit here just because you're probably getting the hang of it at this point, and I want to keep this tutorial as concise as possible. So coming up to the end, you can see that we have 3 more stitches, and then there's that like 3/4 of the way finished iris cluster that we haven't completed all the way. So we're going to skip those final 3 stitches and we're going to complete that iris cluster. So how we're doing that is we're going to double crochet into the same stitch that we worked all of those stitches to start. And then the chain 2, as you can see, that will be a double crochet. And then the 3rd chain of that chain 3 is the chain 1 between the double crochet clusters. So you can kind of see here what it will look like, and we're going to work a double crochet into that same stitch that we started with and began these stitches. So yarn over, work a double crochet into that same stitch, and we have completed our row. So to officially end it, we're going to slip stitch into that chain 3 gap space. So you can see you can kind of pull it apart from the double crochets there and slip stitch into that gap space, just like that. So as you can see, this finishes your lotus or your iris cluster, and you're actually in the middle of that iris cluster. You're not on the edge, and there's really no weird join. It's pretty well camouflaged. So as I mentioned, we're going to be working alternating right side and wrong side rows. So we're going to chain 3 and then turn our work. This is kind of weird because we are working in the round, but this will make it so that our seam up the side of the top stays straight. So there's the first 2 chains are our double crochet, and then that third chain is our chain stitch. So into the gap space that's below the chain right there, you're going to work 2 double crochet stitches. This works to kind of open up that iris cluster as well and make it really look like the other stitches. Just like that. So now we have another 3/4 of the way finished iris cluster, and we're going to continue across our row, our round. So this is round 3. This is a wrong side round. As I mentioned, we will be alternating right side and wrong side. So we're going to skip 4 and then into the chain space right there, we're going to work another iris cluster. So it's pretty easy because we're working into the chain spaces. You don't really have to work that hard to find your next stitch. It's very obvious where it is. So work into that chain stitch, 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochets. Just like so. Chain 1 and 2 more double crochets. All of those stitches into that chain space. And this is where you'll be working into, from this point forward, you'll be working into those chain spaces. The only time you really have to count is that first round. So there you can see, we have that completed. Now we're going to skip 4 once again, and into that next chain space, we're going to work another iris cluster. So 2 double crochet stitches, chain 1, 2 double crochet. Pretty straightforward. So I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit here, and I'm going to show you once again how we will, oh, before I do that, I'm going to show you what I meant, how it looks like you increase for that first round, but you really didn't. As you can see that the stitches, once they develop and once you work that next row, it does create that kind of like scalloped look. The stitches aren't necessarily flat. So then your hem ends up being flat as well. And the stretchiness, you can really start to see how the stretchiness of that foundation single crochet is coming in handy and why it was necessary. So there's the right side, as you can see there, and the wrong side right there. So coming up to the end of this round, we have to finish this final, the first lotus or iris cluster that we worked once more. So once you get to that cluster, we have our final one worked, and then we're going to skip 4 and into that same chain space that we already worked, we're going to work a double crochet and then slip stitch join into the chain again. So work our final double crochet, and then into that chain 3 space, you might have to pull it apart and kind of separate it to see there. You're going to work a slipped stitch. So pull that open if you need help seeing it. And you can see down there how the opening is the same size as the other. If you chain 4, the opening ends up being a little bit bigger. So chaining 3 is what really makes the best look. So we slip stitch to join, now chain 3. And now we are going to turn our work again to work another right side row. So as you can see, we're alternating our rows, and this keeps that seam right up and down. So there's our first 2 chains are the double crochet. The third chain is the chain space, and we're working below this chain into that chain space, 2 double crochets. Once more, you'll do this on every row that you're working in the round. There are some rows that are worked flat, and I'll show you how we do those when we get to them. So now skip 4 once again, and then work another iris cluster into that chain space as we've done up until this point. It's just the 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet. Same throughout. That's what a lotus or an iris cluster is. I keep saying lotus on accident, so I apologize if you hear that. I mean iris stitch. So there we have 3 rows that we're working now. You can see how it's starting to form. You can tell like the join between those stitches is there, but it's really not obvious. It's pretty well camouflaged, and you can just really get a good idea how it's forming. So now we're going to work in the round, alternating right side rows and wrong side rows from this point forward. Depending on the size that you are making, you might be working a different amount of stitches than me, so just be sure to reference the pattern and make sure that you're working the right number of rows from this point. You can work more or less at this point to make your top longer or shorter. I know that some people like to make crop tops or longer, like a tunic length, and you can go ahead and do that here. So I'll show you how to join once more once you get to the end, just for good measure. So when you get to the end of this round, you're going to work a double crochet once again into that same stitch that you did your first stitch cluster into, and then slip stitch with that chain 3 to join and complete this round. So as I mentioned, repeat this all the way around, and it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy. You don't have to think too much about it while you're working the body of your top, which is really nice. I mentioned before, just be sure if you are making this top to reference the pattern, just so that you know how many rows or rounds you have to work from this point. This pattern is available from extra small all the way up until 5XL, so there's quite a few sizes, and that pattern is available on my website for free, or there is a printable option available for purchase as well. So coming up to the end here, we will count our rows to make sure we have the proper amount, and I'm going to show you quick why you need to count those rows, because after you block it, they do get a little bit longer in length. So if your gauge is correct, you will just be able to count your rows, and then although if you were to try this top on right now, it might seem a little shorter, it's because this top actually does get a little bit longer. The stitch does grow in length as you work it. So you can see here I'm counting, that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, all the way up. You can count these iris clusters pretty easy, which makes it really nice, and you know you're getting the right count. So working up to that final, this is our final piece of the body, and then we are going to be moving on to work the back. So as we've been working in the round, now we're going to be working the back, just back and forth flat across almost half of the stitches. There's one iris cluster left at either underarm, and so almost half of the iris clusters to work the back, and then we go back and do the front at the end. So finishing up this round here, we just have to work our final double crochet stitch into that chain space, and then slip stitch into that chain 3 space right there to finish our piece, as you can see. And then we will chain 3 and turn our work. So again, just make sure you have the right amount, and make sure that you finished with a right side round. So make sure the bottom is right side facing. So now turn your work, and we're going to be working these rows flat, which is a little bit easier. We're not going to be doing that unique join in the round anymore. So to work this first row, this is row 1, it's a wrong side row on the back if you're following along with the pattern. We're going to skip 4 and then work our first iris stitch into that chain space. So skip 4 and then into that chain space, work a full iris stitch. We're beginning right away with a full iris stitch here, which is pretty nice. We don't have to worry about that. And you're probably getting pretty good at iris stitch by now. It's just the 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet into that gap space. So I will zoom forward a little bit here because I'm sure you're getting tired of watching me crochet iris stitch. So depending on your size, you will work a certain number. Just count and make sure you have the right amount. And then when you get to the end, be sure you're working the correct amount and then work that final iris cluster as normal. So once you've completed that final iris cluster, we're going to skip one and then work a double crochet for an edge stitch. So you can see there we have 2 double crochets below. So we're skipping that one and then working a double crochet into that next stitch. And then this is the end of our row. This is the end of the stitches that we will be working for the back piece. And now chain 2 and turn. Now we are going to skip 3 and we're going to continue and just work an iris stitch into that next chain space. So 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochet. So the final double crochet and then the chain 2, the turning chain 2 are like our edge stitches, and those are the stitches actually that we'll be working our sleeve into. We're going to be using those to make our sleeve later. I will show you that part once we get to it. So now continue across this row, working an iris cluster into each of these gap spaces. Pretty straightforward. Again, it's really easy. I will zoom forward a little bit because it's a little bit repetitive at this point, I'm sure. So there you can see actually how we have 2 rows worked and those edge stitches that I was talking about. So the final one is a double crochet and then the chain 2, the turning chain, they're just the edge stitches that give us a nice place to work into for our sleeve at a later point. So continuing across this row, all of our back row stitches are going to be worked in this way until we get to the shoulders. Coming to the end of this second row here, it's a little bit more confusing because there was a chain 3 that came from the center of that iris stitch at the underarm, and just make sure that you actually stop at this point and you don't continue working over that chain 3 and continue working around, because we are working flat now, just back and forth across almost half of the stitches. So you have to make sure that you don't continue around. So once you work the final iris stitch, we're going to skip 1 and then double crochet into that last stitch of our row. And then as we did before, we will chain 2 and turn. So now just as we worked row 2, we will work the next row and we will repeat that a few times depending on the size that you're making. And you will just work a few of these rows back and forth before we move forward and shape the back right shoulder. So just into those chain spaces, work our iris clusters and follow the pattern. Make sure that you have the correct number of rows for your chosen size. So I'm going to quickly show you, once I get a couple worked on this row, how to count your rows for the back. So right now we have 3 rows worked for the back. Just make sure you don't count that underarm one, and then you can count your 3 iris clusters up. So again, just work back and forth for your given number of rows. So I'm coming to the back here, or the end here of the rows that I need to work, and I'm going to begin working the back right shoulder. So coming to our final stitch, we're going to chain 2 and turn. And now this is basically just a short row worked across a portion of the back stitches to shape the back right shoulder. So if you look at clothes in your closet, there's generally some neckline shaping that makes it nice and tapered and have a good fit. We're doing this even at the back. The front is going to have a little bit lower of a taper just to give that really nice neckline that you could see in the beginning. So now counting your rows and making sure that you have the right amount. Make sure you don't count that underarm row right there. That one is connected to the body row. So begin counting just the ones that we worked flat back and forth. And make sure you have the correct number. This is pretty important because you just want to make sure you are beginning this back right shoulder with a right side row. So now to begin this back right shoulder, row 1 of the back right shoulder, we're going to just start and work a lotus cluster or an iris cluster as we've done up until this point. And we're going to work, depending on your size, you will work a certain number of iris clusters. It's not that many. And then we'll work a half iris cluster in that final stitch for this row just to give a tapered look. So skip 4 and then work 2 double crochet stitches into that final iris cluster. And now we just chain 1 and turn. Now what we're going to do is even out, so you can see that there's a bit of like a scalloped edge on these stitches. We're just going to even that out so that it's not quite so wavy. So what that means is that we're going to work different heights of stitches. So into the chain space, we're going to be working a slip stitch, and then into the double crochets on either side of the chain, we're going to be working single crochets. And then on the lowest double crochet stitches on the outer edge of each of the iris clusters right there, we're going to be working a half double crochet. So after you've chained 1 and turn, you can see this is an inner piece of an iris cluster. This chain 1 does not count as the first stitch, by the way. So single crochet into that first stitch, and then the next one we're going to half double crochet, and then we're to a full iris cluster. So we're going to half double crochet and then chain 1 or single crochet into the next double crochet. So the double crochets that are closest to the chain 1s are single crochets. And then into that chain stitch, I'm not going into the chain space, I'm going into the stitch. So just the 2 strands at the top. If this is too difficult, just work into the chain space itself. We're just going to work a slip stitch. It does look a little better if you work actually into the stitch, not the chain space, but just work a slip stitch into that one. And then a single crochet in the next stitch, and then we have a half double crochet in each of the next 2 stitches. Then we get to a single crochet again. And then into that chain stitch, we're working a slip stitch once more. Sometimes the chain stitches get a little bit tight, so that's why I say that you can just work into the chain space if you have to. But if you can get into that stitch, that's better. So single crochet, and then your half doubles. So continue this across. This just makes it so that it's a flat, straight edge for your shoulder join, because it is like a scalloped stitch. It wouldn't really join quite as well. So you can look, now that we have a few of them started, you can see how that curves up around the neckline, and then we flatten out the tops of those stitches to give us just a nice edge. So work across the rest of this row in this way to complete your back right shoulder. So we will set aside our back right shoulder and just leave that. And then once we finish the front right shoulder, we will join those together with the shoulder seam. So once you get to the end of that row, just cut your yarn and then pull that strand through to secure. And then you will weave in your ends. You can do that now or later if you prefer. So now moving on to the back left shoulder, we will work a certain number of stitches from the end of that row. So you're going to count your iris stitches over, and into that chain space, you're going to pull up a loop with a new strand of yarn. You have to grab a new strand. So if you're following along with the pattern, this is row 1 of the back left shoulder. Pull up a strand in that chain space and then chain 2. So this is going to count as our first double crochet. And now we're going to double crochet into that same chain space. So that's our half lotus cluster, the same that we did on the opposite side. And now we just have to work across those remaining stitches as regular iris clusters. Excuse me, I think I just said lotus clusters, iris clusters, of course. So just work your iris clusters across to the end of this back left shoulder row. Once you get to the end of that row, we will make an edge stitch just as we've been doing. So we'll skip one and then double crochet into that final stitch. So now you can see we have that partial row just as we do on the other side as well. You can see, and then the space left for the neckline, which we will work at the end. So chain 1 and turn. Again, this chain 1 is not going to count as the first stitch. So we're going to work into that first stitch, which was our double crochet that we ended on. And we have to start with a half double crochet. We're just evening out those stitches again to make a nice straight edge to work into. So then we're to an iris cluster. So we're going to start with a half double crochet and then a single crochet. And then into that chain stitch, we're going to work a slip stitch. Just like so. And then a single crochet again. And a half double. And work in this way across this row to just flatten it out once again. So coming up until the last couple stitches, you can see that we have a half double crochet in one of those final double crochet stitch. And then we have our chain 2 there. You can see it's a little bit tucked down under, and we have to work into that stitch as well. So do a half double crochet into that stitch, and then we need to cut our yarn and pull through that strand to secure. So we are going to just leave these aside for later when we will join the shoulder seams, but you can also weave in your ends now if you want to just add a little bit of security to these stitches. Baby alpaca is kind of a silky yarn, so it can come untied or undone if you don't have it secured. I'm going to quickly show you how to weave in your ends here, just because occasionally I get an email that says someone's ends come undone, and I want to make sure that everyone knows the right way to weave in your ends. So as you can see, I threaded onto a tapestry needle and I'm going in one direction a couple inches with that strand. I didn't tie a knot or anything. It's really not necessary. And it is good. It's good and fine if you split through strands to weave in your end. It kind of makes it a little more secure if you go through some strands and not just through some obvious holes. So now go one direction and then go back across that same direction. And then we're not done. We have to go the third way again. So back, forth, back. So now go back across those stitches. Again, make sure you're not going into the exact same hole on your way back because otherwise it'll just pull right through. The reason you have to go back and forth a couple times is because if you just go one direction, it will work itself out with stretching and pulling. It'll just slowly like inch its way out of its little channel that you created for it. But if you go back and forth a few times, not too tight, just kind of keep a nice proper tension. You really can't see it, especially once you work over it later, and it does just blend in really nicely. I try to weave in my ends as I go, but I know that's kind of complicated. So now moving forward, we're going to work the front piece. So we completed the back, and now we have to work the front and then each of the front shoulders. So as I mentioned, the front will have a lower neckline than the back. It'll just be nicely shaped, lower in the front, just like if you were to look in your closet at a classic crew neck top. The neckline is generally lower in the front, just for more comfort. So to find our spot where we're starting, you're going to begin with the wrong side facing, and then we're going to leave one iris cluster, and then in the for the underarm, and then in the second cluster, we're going to insert our hook into the first double crochet of that second cluster. So leave all of those 5 clusters, and this is all with the wrong side facing you. I'm going to zoom in so that you can really tell which spot this is because it might be a little bit hard to find. So skip that first cluster, and then into the first double crochet of that second cluster, we're going to insert our hook. So this is just beginning the front. This is starting row 1 of the front, if you are following along with the pattern. So with the new strand of yarn, pull up a loop right there, and then we're going to chain 2. So this is our edge stitch that we'll be working into for the sleeve once we get to that point. And you can see we have that one iris cluster left to account for the underarm. So now we're going to continue across working into that chain space. So skip 1 and then work an iris cluster into that chain space. So 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet. I'll zoom out a little further here and continue across this row. So we're going to work across. You can make sure you count and have the right number, but we're going to be working all the way across until the second to last iris cluster stitch that's unworked. So there's our first cluster, and now moving across to the second, we're just going to work across this row in this way. It'll make sense once you get to the end. Each size will have a different number of stitches, but as you can see, there's our underarm iris cluster. We're leaving that one unworked, and then our second to last iris cluster is going to be our final iris cluster. So work a cluster there, 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet, and then we have to make our edge stitch again. So skip 1 and then double crochet into that final double crochet stitch. So there you can see is our underarm, our column of iris stitches for the underarm. So again, skip 1 and then double crochet into that final stitch there. And this is just creating our edge stitch. And then chain 2 and turn again. And we will begin starting on row 2 of the front. So skipping the first 3 and then working a iris stitch into that chain space. And we're going to work this all the way across. Just make sure that you're working into each of those chain spaces, and you will work the number that is noted in the pattern for your size. This is a different number than the back. You just want to be sure that you have the right count because we're going to start working the front left shoulder a little bit lower than we started working the back left shoulder because the front neckline is going to be a little lower. So just again, be sure that you count those edge stitches. Don't count the one that was still in the round, connected to the underarm column. Make sure you have the right stitches, and you should have the right side facing now. So this is actually row 1 of our front left shoulder. We're working a few iris clusters across. So you can see I just worked a couple, and now I work a half iris cluster again. So that's just 2 double crochet stitches into the final stitch for this row. So now you can see that's just our shortened row, and then we're going to chain 2 and turn. Again, make sure in the pattern that you are following the right size for, or the right count for your size, not just following exactly what I'm doing because you might not be making the same size as me. So chain 2 and then turn, and then we're going to skip those 4 stitches all the way until that next iris cluster. So now, as I mentioned, we're working row 2 of the front left shoulder. So working across our iris clusters, just our shortened row. I will zoom ahead a little bit here because we're just working to the end of this row and it's pretty straightforward. So we are working 3 iris rows to shape the front shoulder and front neckline. So when you get to the end, you'll just skip 1 and then work a double crochet into that final stitch. And then as we've been doing, you will just chain 2 and turn. So now this is row 3 of our front left shoulder. And this is our final iris row of the front left shoulder. So beginning as we've been doing up until this point, we just skip 3 and then work iris clusters across the amount required for your size. And then when you get to that last iris cluster, there should be 1 more full iris cluster. You will finish that, and then we have to, you can see I'm comparing it to the back shoulder here and how it's the same size at this point. So if you look at your back shoulder, they will be the same amount, and that's where we will seam. So into that final one, we're just going to work 2 more double crochets in that chain space. And now you can see a little bit how our neckline curved and shaped. So now we need to chain 1 and turn. And then now we're going to be making that flattened out row, straightening it out so that we can seam them together. So this is row 4 of the front left shoulder. So in that first, the chain does not count as the first stitch. So that first stitch will be a single crochet. And then we have a half double crochet. And then a half double crochet into that outer double crochet of the full iris stitch below, and a single crochet, and then a slip stitch into that chain stitch again. So just as we've done on the back shoulders, we will now work across the front shoulders in this way. It's just leveling it out so that it's a nice flat piece to seam. So I'll zoom forward a little bit here because we've seen this a couple times at this point. And coming up to the end, do that final stitch, that final half double crochet, and then you will chain 1 so we can see here. And then I guess before we chain 1 and turn, you can see how it flattened out and how it's more even now. So now chain 1 and turn your work. And now we will actually seam the shoulder the left shoulder together with a slip stitch. So you're going to have to adjust your work a little bit at this point and make it so the back stitches are laying underneath the front stitches. And we're going to do a slip stitch join back loop only to join these. So insert your hook into the back loop only of the first stitch on the front, and then insert your hook into the back loop only, so the strand closest to you of that stitch on the back. And then slip stitch through all of the strands, all of the loops that are on your hook, so all 3 of them. And that is our first slip stitch to join the shoulder. So now again, we'll insert our hook into the back loop only of that next stitch right there, just back loop only. And then look at the back piece, and you're going to go in the back loop only of the back piece as well, which is actually, it looks from this angle, it looks like the front loop, so it's the loop closest towards you. Insert your hook, pull up a loop, pull through all of the loops on your hook. So you will work across in this same way. Insert back loop only into the first stitch on the front, back loop only into the first stitch on the back. This one looks a little tighter, but just make sure you get every stitch so that you have the right count, and then slip stitch all the way through. You'll repeat this all the way across to seam your shoulder. It's pretty nice. It's easier than a mattress stitch or another way to join because it's just in the work. You don't have to use an extra strand of yarn or anything. It is a little bit tricky to get the hang of it, and it feels a little bit awkward, but just take your time and be sure you don't do it too tight. I know some people work their slip stitches really tight, but slip stitches do have less stretch than regular stitches. So you just want to make sure that you're not working these stitches too tight. If you end up making them be too tight and it kind of cinches it up, you're going to have to take it out and try with a larger hook size. It's just really important that it's the nice, same, even tension that you've done throughout your work. So now that we have a few worked, you can see how it is forming. It's kind of just like a nice thick edge for a little bit of support, and the slip stitch detail looks really nice and clean and polished there as well. It does have a little bit of stretch, but it is secure, and it's nice how it's just in the work. So continue across in this way, back loop only on the front, back loop only on the back, and slip stitch join. We will do this on each shoulder, so we haven't worked the front right shoulder yet, but once we do that, we will join it with the back right shoulder as well. And then after that, we just have our neckline and sleeves. So we're really getting to the end here. You've been doing a great job. If you've been following along up until this point, thank you. I'm excited to see your finished tops. So coming to the end here, we have our final slip stitch and pull through. And you can see how it looks. It has just a nice thick seam look to it, and it's nice and flat. It looks really good. So cut your yarn, leave a tail, and then pull through to secure. So you can see the end, the front neckline, how it curves up there. It's a little bit flat in the middle, and then we will work up the other side to now shape the front right shoulder. So just as we did for the back shoulder, we have to now find the spot that we're going to begin on the front. So count over from, with the right side facing you, count over from the edge. You will be leaving some unworked at the center of the neckline, and this just kind of gives that lower, that like crew neck finish. So once you've counted over from the left how many lotus clusters or iris clusters you will be working into, insert your hook into that chain space and pull up a loop. And then you will chain 2 once more. into that chain space again, you will work a double crochet. Just secure your end so that it doesn't come through, kind of pull it to the side, but you can see now that it matches as best as it could. And we will work a neckline, so it will look really similar and nice and polished when we get that done. So now work your iris clusters across this row. I will zoom forward a little bit. When you get to the end, just once more, skip one, and then double crochet into that final stitch, just like so. Chain 2 and turn. And now we will work across this row. You need to skip 3 and work a iris cluster into that chain space. So working up the number of clusters that is noted for your size, you will actually be ending with a full iris cluster for this row into that final full iris cluster stitch. So again, just make sure that you're working the right number of clusters for your size. So final iris cluster, and then this is a little bit different here because we have to do that edge stitch so that we have that nice curve and we don't have like a little jagged edge. So we're going to skip 1, and then into that second stitch we're going to work a final double crochet. And see, you can tell that it makes that nice curve, and without that final double crochet it wouldn't have a nice curved finish. There would be a bit of a jog over. So now chain 2 and turn. So now we're going to skip 3, and then into that chain space we're going to be working 2 double crochet stitches. So just 2 double crochet stitches into that first chain space for another half lotus cluster. And then skip 4 and work your iris cluster. Work your iris cluster into that chain space again. And in each one all the way across this row. So now you can really see that we finished the like cluster rows, or we're on our last iris cluster row. You can see how the neckline is formed. And it is a little bit like, depending on if you add a chain 2 turn or a double crochet turn, it looks a little bit different, but when we pick up the stitches we smooth all of that out. So don't be worried if your neckline looks a little bit jagged in spots at this point. That's normal, and we will fix that with the neckline. So continuing across in each of your iris clusters until the end of the row, and then we will skip 1 once more and work a final double crochet into that next stitch, and then chain 1 and turn. Now we're working that final stitch again, just to that final row, just to even it out so it's more flat. So in that first one we are going to work a half double crochet, and then now we have our first iris cluster. So a half double crochet, single crochet, slip stitch, single crochet, half double crochet, same as we've been doing in each of the shoulders up until this point to flatten out that last row. And just pull that through, single crochet, and then half double. I'll zoom forward a little bit here because we've done this a couple times now, so I'm sure you're an expert at this repeat. So coming up until the final stitch, we actually are going to skip that final stitch so that our count is the same. And now we're going to chain 1 and turn. And now we have to join the back just as we did for the front. So insert that hook into the back loop only of the front stitch and back loop only, so the loop that's facing you of the back stitch, and slip stitch those to join. And repeat this in each stitch across the same way that we did for the other shoulder. Again, just make sure, you really want to make sure that you're not working these slip stitches too tight, because if you do work them too tight, you will have a cinched up shoulder and it won't really have that nice drape that the whole top and this yarn and everything that this stitch is kind of designed for, is that drape. So make sure you don't work these slip stitches too tight. You just want a nice, loose, even tension. So back loop only on the front, back loop only on the back, and slip stitch across to join. The final stitch here, it's kind of hard to see because I haven't weaved in that end yet, so just pull over that strand if you need help finding it, because it is a little bit awkward if you can't quite see. So now you can tell it's so awkward to pull it through. So if that's happening to you, just pull that strand over and then it's more obvious where your stitch is. So yep, that's the tail. Just pull that tail, that strand that's the tail over, and then you can more obviously see where you need to slip stitch. So cut your yarn and pull through to secure, and now we have both of the shoulders joined. So that's a great feeling. We have some ends to weave in. You can see at the top there, it's just that nice stretchy finished shoulder. And we have our neckline. So you can see the front of the neckline is shaped lower than the back, and it will be a really comfortable fit. So now what we need to do is the neckline and then the sleeves, and then we are completed. So I will show you how to work the neckline first. So to begin, we will start at the back. So turn your piece over so that the back neckline is facing you. Grab your strand of yarn and your crochet hook. So into that chain space that is on the edge of the neckline, so where you started to work the shoulder and then where the back is flat and those iris clusters are still exposed, that corner is where you're going to insert your hook, and we're going to work across that, and we have to even this out just as we've been doing for the top of the shoulders. We have to do that across the neckline just so that we have a nice finished edge to work the neckline into. So into that piece, we're going to insert our hook into that corner chain space, chain one, and I zoomed in a little bit here so you can see, but we're working into that first double crochet after the chain space. So it's a single crochet, and then we have a half double crochet, and then another half double crochet, and a single crochet, and a slip stitch. And I'm actually working my slip stitch just into the chain space at this point. I'm not going to go into the stitch itself, just into that chain space is fine for your slip stitch, because we are going to be working another row, and it doesn't really change the look at this point the same way that it did for the shoulders. So single crochet and then half double crochet on those two outer double crochet stitches, and repeat this all the way across. So we are again just evening out the back of the neckline. We'll do this at the front of the neckline as well, and this just makes it so that we have a nice flat smooth space to work into for our next row. The neckline is just 2 rows. This is the first one. It's kind of like the set up row. So I'm going to zoom forward a little bit here because you definitely know how to do this at this point. So now we're to the next corner, and we're going to end with a single crochet in that final double crochet stitch. We're not working into that chain space at all because we don't need to, actually. So now we're going up the left side of the neckline. So if you're following along with the pattern, just make sure I have the counts of stitches that you will be picking up essentially. So you're going to be working into the edges of stitches, which is always a little bit confusing. So if it's a chain 2 or a double crochet, we're picking up 2 stitches into it, and just because it's 2 single crochet stitches tall, so we're picking up single crocheting 3 stitches up the side of this back part of the neckline to the shoulder seam. So when you're working into these edge stitches, I like to go into 2 of the 3 chains or stitch edges. Once you get to the top of the shoulder seam, we're going to single crochet 1 into the shoulder seam itself. And then we're going to single crochet 9 stitches down the other side of the neckline. So if it was a chain 2 or a double crochet, we're picking up 2 in each of those. So for each lotus row, or I mean iris row that we worked, we have to pick up 2 stitches along the edge of that row. It might take a little bit of trial and error if you're not used to working necklines, but as you can see here, I'm not working into that chain space. I'm going into the stitch itself. So because we're working into the edge stitches, I don't need to pick or to single crochet into that chain space. So I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit here, just make sure you get the right count. So at this point, you should have 13 stitches for the left side. That's not including the back neckline stitches that you've single crocheted. If you're a stitch off or so, it's really not that big of a deal. But just the count is to keep you as close as possible. So now we're going to even out the front of the neckline. So we're not working into that first chain space, that flat space across. We're just working into the first stitch. So it's a single crochet, and then we have the 2 half double crochet stitches. And again, this is just in the flat stitches across the front neckline. So single crochet and then slip stitch into the chain space, and repeat this across the front of the neckline. There's really not very many for the front of the neckline. The number that you do have to single crochet varies depending on your size at this point, but there's not that many, and it should be pretty easy to see these ones. So coming up to the end here, there's our chain space, and we're going to actually have to work, you can see we have our final stitch right there that we have to single crochet. And then so up the side of the right side of the neckline, we're going to pick up just as we did for the left side. So you can see how it evened out. It smoothed it out on the left side and the front, and we'll smooth it out even more with the next row that we work. It will just get better and better. So now we have to pick up on the right side up to the shoulder seam. We're going to pick up or single crochet 9 stitches up to the shoulder seam. So we're not going into that chain space itself, but just into the chain 2 that was the turning chain. I'm just getting 2 of those 3 strands whenever possible, and working all the way up. Make sure that you get the right number. If you can't get the right number, don't overstress it. If you end up picking up an extra stitch or single crocheting an extra stitch or 1 fewer, it's really not that big of a deal. With crochet, it's not like it's not going to unravel or anything. So you just want to go slow and steady, make sure that it looks nice, and get into each stitch as best as possible. So you can see there's a chain 2 right there. So we're single crocheting twice into that chain 2 into each of the chain. So each of the turning chains all the way up to the shoulder seam on this side. Once you get to the shoulder seam, you pick up 1 stitch, and then you have to pick up 3 more, or single crochet 3 more down to the beginning of where you started with your neckline. So these are both right side rows. I should point that out. We're not turning it after we join, but once you do get to the end, you will slip stitch to join with that first single crochet stitch that you worked. And now chain 1. This does not count as the first stitch. And now we're going to slip stitch back loop only in each stitch around the neckline. So again, just make sure that you don't work these slip stitches too tight, because then you'll just have a really tight neckline and no one likes that. You want your neckline to just be a nice even tension. A little bit snug so that it doesn't become overstretched is good, but that will happen naturally. Just be careful not to make these slip stitches too tight. So slip stitch back loop only all the way across. You can kind of see how they're starting to shape now. We just have like a thickened edge, almost like that I-cord edge that I've mentioned earlier. So continue around the entire neckline in this way. I'll zoom forward a little bit here, just because it's a little repetitive. And then I will show you how to join the end of the neckline too, so that it's really seamless and you don't have an obvious edge. So I guess I've worked a few stitches at this point, and you can just see how it's a nice thickened edge and it looks like that I-cord again. So single crochet or slip stitch back loop only all the way around. So that's the slip stitch. We're not working into the slip stitch that we joined. So we're actually finished here. And I'm going to show you how we can join this stitch and the first stitch of the round really seamlessly, so that it looks like it's just all one piece around the entire work. Check your tension here. Make sure that you didn't do it too tight or too loose. I doubt that you will do it too loose, but make sure you didn't do it too tight. Cut your yarn and then pull through that strand. You'll want to thread your needle and make sure you don't pull it too tight at this point, because then that final stitch will look really small and you don't want that. You want them all to look the same. So thread your needle, and then we're going to almost like duplicate or kind of like copy that stitch right there. So you're going to insert, follow that stitch. So insert into the stitch above it, and then loop your yarn back around and go into the center of that stitch that your yarn came out of, just like that. And now weave in this end and tighten it a little so that it's just the same tension as the others, but you can see how that looks really seamless and finished. So weave in your ends and you can now see your finished neckline. It's smoothed out and it just looks really nice and beautiful. And then when you block it, you can make sure you lay it a nice smooth way and it will look even better. So now moving on to the sleeves. This is our final part. We have 2 sleeves to work and they're pretty easy. We're going to be back to working this iris stitch in the round, so I'll touch base on how to do that once more. So beginning at the underarm, I'm going to zoom in here. You're going to start at the iris cluster that is at the underarm. Insert your hook into that chain space, pull up a loop, and then chain 3. So remember this chain 3, the first 2 chains are the double crochet, and then the third chain is the chain space between. So we're going to work 2 double crochets into that same chain space, and there is our iris cluster that is 3/4 of the way finished. So now we're going to be working up those edge stitches that I talked about before. These are the turning chains, or the chain 2 turning chains, or the final double crochet stitch of each row. They just kind of have this border that goes up. So make sure you're starting not at an angle. You want to get just that first turning chain. So right there. It's easy to find. Just make sure you're looking around a bit and have the right one, because if you don't, you will end up at the wrong spot once you get to the top. So in that first edge stitch, I'm going to call that, you can see them there, you're going to work a iris cluster. So into that first edge stitch, 2 double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets into, and this is all with the right side facing. So you're working this first round with the right side of your work facing. So now we've completed our first iris cluster for the sleeve. And you can see there, that's where the row, it kind of curves around. We have the underarm one and then the first edge stitch of the next row. So now we're going to skip that next edge stitch and work into the following one. So we're working into every other one of the edge stitches up until the shoulder seam. And work another iris cluster into this part, just as you did on the last edge stitch. We're using these as kind of like our chain spaces for this. So skip that next edge stitch and then work a iris cluster into that next edge stitch, the following edge stitch. I'm gonna zoom forward a little bit here. Just repeat and work up in every other edge stitch up the side of your shoulder. So when you get to the top of the shoulder seam, you will have one edge stitch left, and then you'll be to the shoulder seam itself. So we have to work into that actual shoulder seam. So it might be kind of tight, but just try your best to work into a really snug spot, like into the shoulder seam itself, if you possibly can. If you have to choose a little bit bigger spot, you can go right next to it, but just try to work your iris cluster into that shoulder seam. So again, 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet at the top of the shoulder. And now this one, it got a little bit loose here, so I'm going to kind of fake this closed a little bit. So if this happens to you, you can like grab a strand before you go into the same hole and kind of just like cinch up that part. I think I didn't weave in this end very well or something, but just kind of tighten it up if you need to. You shouldn't need to, but if you get in this position, don't stress. So then your final double crochet of that top iris cluster. And then we will repeat down the back of the sleeve. There you can see how I picked it up, and you really can't even tell that I cinched up that final stitch. So skip that next edge stitch and work into the second edge stitch down the side of the shoulder. So right there, work another iris cluster, and then repeat this down the edge of the stitch, working into every other, down the edge of the sleeve, working into every other edge stitch. So once you get to the bottom, you will have your final edge stitch will be right next to that iris cluster at the underarm. So work your final iris cluster into that stitch that's right next to the underarm. And then now we have to finish that underarm iris cluster. So you can kind of see there's that 3/4 of the way finished cluster. And we just have to join this, and then we're finished with our first row of the sleeve, our first round. So our final double crochet. And then again, just as we did with the body, we're going to slip stitch into that chain 3 space to join right there. Slip stitch. And then again, just as we did for the body, we're going to chain 3 and turn. And now we're working on round 2, so a wrong side round of our sleeve. So begin with our 2 double crochet stitches in that same chain space. And now it's really easy to find your chain spaces. So we're just going to skip 4 as we've done, and then we work into the chain spaces of those iris clusters. We don't have to look for any edge stitches or anything special. And we're just going to work our next row in the round as we did for the body. So coming up to the end of this round 2, we have to work our final double crochet and then slip stitch with that chain 3 space to join. And you can see how we have those 2 rows of our sleeve, chain 3 and turn. So now row 3 and 4, are done just as round too. So if you want to make your sleeves longer or shorter, this is a good spot to do it. You can work more rows. You can either stop here with 2 rows, or you can work more. So 4 rows for the sleeves is how the 4 iris cluster rows of the sleeves is how the pattern is written. But if you want longer sleeves, you can work more. Just be sure that you end with a wrong side round. So you're going to work any additional rounds in multiples of 2. So you can work either 4 rounds, 6 rounds, 8 rounds, or so on. You could go all the way to long sleeves if you wanted. And then when you get to the final round, we just completed round 4 of our sleeve. We just chain 1 and turn. So now, as we've done up until this point, you can see there's our 4 rounds there. Even number of rounds for the sleeves. And then now we just have to even out the edge of the sleeve. So as we've been doing on the tops of the shoulders and the neckline, we just begin with a single crochet and then half double crochet, half double crochet, single crochet, slip stitch, single crochet, half double crochet, all the way around. It's kind of a mouthful, but you'll just work to even out, flatten out these stitches so that you have a nice, smooth, even edge. Once you get to the end of this row, you will work a single crochet and then a slip stitch, and then you will slip stitch to join with that first stitch that you worked. Chain 1 and do not turn. Where row 6 is another right side row, so we keep the right side facing us. And as we did for the neckline, we're just going to slip stitch back loop only in each stitch around the armhole opening. So again, just be sure you don't work this too tight, or otherwise your sleeve will kind of have a little bit of a tightened fit, which you don't want. So just slip stitch back loop only all the way around the armhole opening to finish the sleeve. So I'm going to zoom forward a little bit here. You can see how it's starting to look, kind of just that, again, like a thickened edge that gives just a nice hem, basically. So continuing that all the way around the entire armhole opening. Once you get to the end of this row, you're going to work your final slip stitch, and then remember that that is a slip stitch connected to the chain, so you're not going to be working into that. Cut your yarn and then pull your yarn through, your strand through all the way to secure. Weave in your end, and so you can see now how we have a finished sleeve. Repeat for your second sleeve, and then you will need to block your top by soaking it in lukewarm, almost cool water, and lay the top flat to dry. When you do lay it flat to dry, just make sure you shape the neckline nicely and it doesn't have any lumps, and everything looks nice and smooth. This just holds it in position. Make sure you don't overstretch it or anything. Try and stick with the right dimensions. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions, and be sure to subscribe or check out my other tutorials if you want to keep in touch. Thanks so much for watching.